So over the last month, we've been thinking about God's faithfulness. We've had a series about God's faithfulness. And the reason we've been doing that is because next weekend, we are celebrating as a church 10 years of God's faithfulness. 10 years ago, a small team planted into the old building over the road. It was due to close, and a small team moved up, really with the mandate, with the commission to seek to reach younger generations and to see the church come alive again. And for many of you, you may have been part of that story for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. For some of you, like it's literally this week, you're part of that story. But for each one of you, you will have in the background of your life stories of God's faithfulness, whether you recognize it or not. God has been at work. God has been faithful. And so over this last month, we've been thinking all about God's faithfulness, how he's always loving, always following through on his promises no matter what. And so we've looked at a character in the Old Testament called Gideon and how God is faithful against all the odds. We've looked at a guy called Joshua and how God is faithful with us wherever we go, whatever circumstances we go into. And we've looked at Abraham right at the beginning of the Bible and looked at how God is faithful to all his promises. And similar to actually what Callum was saying, even if it doesn't happen instantly, even if it seems like, God, when are you going to fulfill that promise? Actually, the story of Abraham shows us and reminds us that God is always faithful to his promises. And I hope for those of you who have been here over the last 2-3 weeks as we've done that, but even tonight, if it's your first time, that as you stop and think, you might be encouraged to just consider how God has been faithful in your life. And you might pause and just think, how does God's faithfulness give you real hope that you can trust him for the future because he's been faithful in the past? I hope as well, as it did for Abraham and Joshua and Gideon, that it inspires you to want to be faithful in response to his faithfulness, that it calls out this sense of wanting to be faithful to God just as he's been faithful to us. As we've encountered his love, we've learned to live more like Jesus, and now we're excited to go and share with others. That's all well and good, but what happens when we're not faithful? What happens when we're not faithful? And today we're going to look at this story that Jesus told his followers about the prodigal son or the lost son. And we'll see through it that even when we're not faithful, God still is. Now, God's love has been casting back to primary school days. You might have sung a song, but God's love has been described. God's faithfulness has been described as a circle, a bit like these bubbles that hopefully are going to pop out. Sorry, on the front row. God's love has been described like a circle, his faithfulness like a perfect circle in that it never ends. It goes on and on. There's absolutely no end to it. And the Bible tells us that as humans, created in the image of God, that we take on, when he created us, we took on his shape. That the idea was that what was true of God's faithfulness and love, never ending, would be true for us as well. That as you look at us, actually it's a glimpse into who God is. The way we live is to point to God. That's the shape we were created to be, perfect, created to reflect his image. And we read in this story, the prodigal son was at home with his father. Everything that the father had, and we get the impression this wasn't just someone scratching a living out of the land. This was a guy who was fairly wealthy. He had rings to put on his fingers, cloaks, killed the fattened calf. This was a guy of some means, and we know that the prodigal son at home with his father, while he was with his father, had absolutely everything that he could ever want. Everything was his, and he was shaped by his father's love and faithfulness. But then we read, for whatever reason, despite his father's love and faithfulness, the son had decided that maybe that wasn't enough for now, that maybe just for a moment he wanted to try another shape. He wanted to try and be another shape. Not the shape that his father had created him to be, but to experiment and to look to be another shape. Perhaps there was a better way to live. Perhaps there was more in the world out there than his father had shown him. Perhaps he was missing out by staying in his father's house. Perhaps it meant life was a bit boring and too full of rules. Perhaps it prevented him having fun. Perhaps he just took his father's love and faithfulness for granted because he'd grown up in that household. And so he went to his father and he asked for the money that he would usually only get once his father was dead. I mean, this is massively offensive. It's like going up to your mom or your dad or your primary kind of carer and saying, thank you so much for everything you've done for me, for all you've given me, for your faithfulness over the years. I'd quite like it if you were dead now so I could have your money. Like, it's really offensive. It's like saying, you're dead to me. You're dead to me. I couldn't care. You're dead to me. And so the son rejects the shape that he's been made in. He rejects that image of the father, that knowing everything, his father's faithfulness. He rejects that. He turns his back on home and he decides to live a different shape. And for a while, to be fair to the guy, it seems to work out well. He obviously has a great time. He goes out, he splashes the cash, he kind of goes mad, he lives high living. He has a great time with all that his father has given him, all the gifts, all the talents, all the wealth that his father's given him. He goes and he uses, but he uses them in the wrong way. What we read is he really ends up wasting them. He ends up kind of finding himself in a real mess. That the friends that he thought were friends, he realizes were friends he was just able to buy. Or friends that just kind of wanted him around whenever he kind of fitted their shape. And we find that he's in a mess. He's done some dodgy stuff. He has no meaningful friends. And we read he's a long way from home. He's turned his back on all he knew. And he ends up kind of in a new shape, a bit battered, a bit bruised, totally different from the shape that his father had designed for him. And so he ends up unhappy, lonely, guilty, feeding pigs. And for feeding pigs in that culture, Jews, like pigs for them, were totally unclean. And so to be feeding pigs was the lowest of the low. He'd hit rock bottom. It was full of shame. He'd become this different shape. But we read in the passage, the Bible says, suddenly he comes to his senses. He remembers home. But he thinks, I can never go back to being my father's son. There's too much that's happened. I've gone too far down the road. I can never go back to that shape. My father won't have me. But what instead if I take on a different shape? What if instead I take on the shape not of a son, but of a servant? What might happen then if I beg enough? If I try hard enough to be good, to please him and serve him, he may just have me back. Anything's got to be better than living like this. And so that's what he decides to do. Now, before we go any further in this journey of the lost son, I just love us to consider that this passage talks about two sons. And arguably, it talks about two lost sons. Because what do we notice about this older son? Good old, faithful, reliable, sensible, rule-following, dutiful, older son. And yet, when we get a glimpse into his heart as his brother returns home, what we actually see is that maybe in more subtle, less extravagant, but nevertheless just as profound ways, the older son's shape has become distorted, it's become knocked about, it's become battered, it's become bruised, that he's lost something of the shape that he too was created to be. You see, the older son is in his father's house where he has everything. Everything's available to him. And yet we see in this moment that he's resentful, he's jealous, he's insecure, and he's restricted and held captive by those emotions rather than being free. On the outside, he does everything a good son is supposed to do. But on the inside, he's wandered away from his father just the same as the younger son has. He did his duty, worked hard every day and fulfilled all his obligations, but he's become increasingly unhappy and unfree. Now, are any of you the oldest sibling in your family? A few of you. Have any of you older ones ever complained a bit that your younger siblings, particularly if there's 3 or 4 of you, the youngest sibling gets away with murder? Yeah? It's tough being the oldest child, isn't it? I wouldn't know. I never was one. But I know our eldest, Erin, she's now and again, she'll kind of complain that Joel, who's our youngest, our third and youngest, has it so much easier than she ever did. She had the harder boundaries because she went through everything first. She has the most responsibility to bear. And well, Joel just gets to enjoy life and is free to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. That's her perception. She loves him, but there's times when she maybe just resents being the older child a little bit. And I'm not slating my own daughter here, but just go back to the older son. It's just by way of an illustration. There is perhaps something in the attitudes of that older son. And perhaps there's something in that attitude of each of us, where the obedience and dutiful and following Jesus, sometimes if we're not careful, can begin to become a burden, and kind of the service can feel like a bit like slavery. Like we start complaining, we start getting self-righteous, we start maybe condemning others. And if you're not careful, you can go down this bit of a rabbit hole where you can become more lost, feel more isolated, and feel more misunderstood. And what we see in the older son, as a party's kicking off full of joy, is that the older son is suspicious of that joy. That's a red flag. Whenever joy fails to elicit joy in ourselves, that's a red flag. I'm far more like the older son than the younger son. The older son expresses a fear that he's been left out, that he wasn't good enough, that he's been overlooked, that no one appreciates him, that he hasn't got quite as amazing testimony as the next person, that God seems to answer that person's prayer, but not my prayer, that God seems to do that over here, but not here. Why, God, won't you? He gets into that pan. And it becomes clear that this son too has taken on other shapes, other than the ones that God designed for him. It becomes clear that this son too is in as much need of healing and forgiveness and restoration as the younger son. And so this evening, what shape do you find yourself in? What shape do you find yourself in as you're sat here this evening? Maybe you've gone off down that road to party willingly. It's more exciting. Maybe you've been led there by someone else. So-called friends are shaping you and having more of an impact on the shape you are than your Father in heaven. Or maybe bit by bit, your heart has just been hardened, one small disappointment after the other. But as the story continues, we see the Father's response. For the younger son, it says, even when he was still a long way off, the Father runs to him to meet him and welcomes him home. I just want us to notice a couple of things there. The Father is watching and waiting. He doesn't know his son's coming back, but he's watching and waiting. He's not sat inside watching the TV. He's not out in the field. He's on the doorstep, watching and waiting, looking down the lane, ready for that moment when the son returns. And so the son doesn't need to walk up and ring the front doorbell or track his father down on the estate because the father is ready. The father also runs to meet him. That wasn't normal for a father in those days of that position. In fact, to do so would be to give up your kind of reputation, your dignity. It's almost shameful to kind of adopt that posture. And yet, isn't that what Jesus did on the cross for us? The Father embraces him and kisses him. In that culture, you wouldn't kiss a servant, but you would kiss your son. And so even before the son has got to the Father, ready with his prepared speech to say, let me be your servant, the Father has already kissed him on the cheek and said to him, you are my son. Before the son has even said anything. The Father goes all out to welcome the son home, restore him to the shape he was created for. And then just think about the older son for a moment, because actually it's a parallel. The son is out in the field. He's away from the house where the joy is, where the party is. But the invitation is the same. The father goes out and he welcomes his son home. Come in and eat and celebrate. Experience my joy. Come home. Be restored to the shape you were created for. All I have is yours. It's the same invitation, the same response. He doesn't love one son more than the other. He wants to restore them both and welcome them both home. I don't know if you noticed, but every time I blew a bubble out of one of these slightly odd shapes, what shape was the bubble? It was always the same. It was always round. You see, despite the younger son turning his back on home, rejecting his father, wasting all his father had given him, despite him being unfaithful to the image of God in him, God was always faithful. Even when the son took on a different shape, God's faithfulness remained the same. Despite the older son growing resentful, joyless, self-righteous, rejecting the freedom of his father's love, despite him being unfaithful and taking on all kinds of different shapes he was never intended to have, God doesn't change. God's faithfulness at work in his life remains constant. 2 Timothy says that if we are faithless, God remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. It's the heart of the gospel that you are loved. You're created in his image, and he will always be faithful. Despite our mess-ups, our guilt, our shame, despite our feeling we're a long way from home or in a distant land, he's always waiting, watching, ready to embrace us, to welcome us home, and to restore us. And so the invitation for each one of us, and the invitation for a city out there, for university campuses, for your schools, for your workplaces, the invitation is the same. Would you come to your senses and turn again to face home? That's what repentance means, to turn again to face. And the message, the gospel is that God our Father is already waiting. He's already running to meet and embrace us and restore his image in us. I don't know if you noticed, but the story is unresolved. We don't hear what happens to the younger son. We don't hear whether the older son accepts the invitation. It's left to them to choose. And that's our choice too. The invitation is there. The invitation to the welcome embrace of the Father, to be restored into his likeness, is there. It's our choice. Are we going to choose to be faithful to his faithfulness? Amen.